Marcus Johnson, a 22-year-old college student, was driving his old car down a quiet road on his way home. It was a peaceful evening, with the dim yellow glow of streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement after a light rain. Marcus had just left a friend's house after a study session, feeling relaxed as he thought about the upcoming weekend and the chance to finally rest. Soft music played in the background, and he tapped his fingers on the steering wheel to the rhythm, unaware that in just a few minutes, his life would change forever. As Marcus turned onto a smaller road, flashing red and blue lights suddenly appeared in his rearview mirror. The piercing sound of a police siren shattered the calm of the night. Marcus glanced at the mirror, spotting a police car tailing him closely. He frowned, wondering what he had done wrong. There were no speed limit signs he had violated, and he was sure he had followed all traffic rules. Still, Marcus pulled over to the side of the road, as any law-abiding citizen would. When the car came to a stop, Marcus rolled down his window and placed both hands on the steering wheel, just as his family had taught him in those difficult conversations about how to handle encounters with the police. He knew that, as a black man, every move he made could be misinterpreted. His heart raced as he watched Officer Jack Miller step out of the police car, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. Jack was a middle-aged man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a cold expression and sharp eyes. He approached Marcus's car, shining a flashlight directly into his face. "Your taillight's out," Jack said, his tone firm and unfriendly. Marcus frowned. "Officer, I don't think my taillight is out. I just checked it this morning." Jack smirked, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "Are you arguing with me? Step out of the car." A wave of tension ran down Marcus's spine. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but he also understood that arguing with a police officer in this situation could lead to serious consequences. Taking a deep breath to steady himself, Marcus slowly opened the door and stepped out of the car. Jack began searching Marcus's car without asking for permission or providing any valid reason. He opened the trunk, rummaged through the back seat, and even checked the glove compartment. Marcus stood on the side of the road, feeling a mix of helplessness and anger rising within him. He knew this wasn't a routine traffic stop. This was racial profiling, an abuse of power he had heard about far too many times from friends and family. "Got anything to hide?" Jack asked, his tone dripping with suspicion. "No, officer. I have nothing to hide. I'm just on my way home," Marcus replied, trying to keep his voice calm. Jack continued searching for a few more minutes before suddenly pulling out a small bag of white powder from under the driver's seat. He held it up in front of Marcus, his eyes filled with accusation. "What's this?" Jack asked coldly. Marcus froze in shock. "I don't know what that is. It's not mine. Are you trying to frame me?" Jack raised an eyebrow as if he had been expecting that response. "You think I'm going to believe that? You're under arrest for possession of illegal drugs." "No, I didn't do anything wrong," Marcus shouted, his voice filled with anger and panic. He tried to explain, but Jack wasn't listening. Instead, the officer turned Marcus around, shoved him against the car, and roughly handcuffed him. "You have the right to remain silent," Jack said, his tone as cold as ever, as if he had done this hundreds of times before. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Marcus felt the sharp pain of the handcuffs digging into his wrists. He tried to stay calm, but the fear and helplessness were suffocating. He looked around, hoping someone would witness this injustice, and fortunately, someone did. Across the street, a passerby had stopped and was recording the entire incident on their phone. "He didn't do anything wrong," the passerby shouted. "I've got it all on video. This is police abuse." Jack turned his head, his expression flashing with irritation. "Back off! This is police business." But the passerby didn't stop. They kept recording, and their words gave Marcus a small glimmer of hope. At least the truth was being captured. At least he wasn't completely alone. Jack shoved Marcus into the back seat of the police car and slammed the door shut. Marcus sat inside, looking out the window, seeing the passerby still recording. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew his life had been forever altered in just a few short minutes. As the police car drove away, the passerby quickly uploaded the video to social media, captioning it, "Police abuse of power. A young black man arrested for no reason. Share this to demand justice." Within hours, the video began spreading like wildfire. Outraged comments, calls for action, and similar stories from others started flooding in. The incident was no longer just a small-town event. It had become a spark, ready to ignite a larger fire, challenging an entire system. Just hours after the video of Marcus Johnson's arrest was uploaded to social media, it spread like wildfire. The clear footage of Officer Jack Miller searching Marcus's car without any valid reason, followed by the scene of Marcus being handcuffed and shoved into the police car, sparked outrage across the internet. The video was shared thousands of times, accompanied by captions like, "Police abuse of power, justice for Marcus Johnson, and this is why we need police reform." The comments under the video quickly turned into a heated forum. Some people shared similar stories of injustice they or their loved ones had experienced, while others called for immediate action. One user wrote, "I'm so tired of seeing this happen. How many more people have to suffer before we see real change?" Another commented, "This isn't just about Marcus. This is about every black person who's been treated like a criminal just because of the color of their skin." Meanwhile, at the Johnson household, Marcus's family was enduring a sleepless night. Linda Johnson, Marcus's mother, sat on the couch, clutching her phone tightly, her eyes red from crying. She had watched the video of her son's arrest countless times, and each time it felt like her heart was being torn apart. Marcus was her only son, a hard-working college student who always tried to do the right thing. And yet, here he was, being treated like a criminal. "My son did nothing wrong," Linda said, her voice trembling but filled with determination. "They had no right to treat him like that." Sitting beside her was James Johnson, Marcus's father, who always tried to remain calm in difficult situations. But even he couldn't hide his anger. "We can't let this go," he said, his voice low but firm. "We have to do something." Marcus, who had just been released from the police station after hours of being detained, sat quietly in the corner of the room. He was still in shock from what had happened. The feeling of helplessness as he was handcuffed, falsely accused, and treated like a criminal lingered in his mind. But when he saw the pain in his mother's eyes, he knew he couldn't stay silent. "I don't want this to just end here," Marcus said, breaking the silence. "I want justice, not just for me, but for everyone who's been treated like this." Linda nodded, tears streaming down her face. "We'll do whatever it takes to get justice for you, Marcus. I promise." The next morning, the Johnson family began searching for legal help. They knew that to take on the police system, they needed someone experienced and determined. After several calls and recommendations, they were connected with Sarah Lopez, a renowned civil rights attorney who had fought for justice in many similar cases. Sarah Lopez was a formidable woman with over 15 years of experience defending the rights of the oppressed. She had taken on major cases, from police misconduct to lawsuits against large corporations. With her long black hair and sharp, focused eyes, Sarah was not only an exceptional lawyer, but also an inspiration to those around her. When Sarah received the call from the Johnson family, she immediately agreed to meet with them. She had already seen the video of Marcus's arrest and was outraged by what she had witnessed. "This is a textbook case of abuse of power," she told her assistant. "We can't let this continue to happen." The meeting between Sarah and the Johnson family took place at her office, a small but welcoming space adorned with photos and awards that showcased her successful career. When the Johnsons arrived, Sarah stood up, shook each of their hands, and offered a warm smile. "I'm so sorry for what your family has been through," she said, "but I'm here to help." Linda, still emotional, recounted the entire story, from the moment Marcus was pulled over to his arrest. Sarah listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes in her notebook. When Linda finished, Sarah nodded, her expression resolute. "We have a strong case," she said. "This video is clear evidence of police misconduct, but to bring this case to light, we need to be thorough. I'm not just going to fight for Marcus, I'm going to fight for everyone who's ever been treated unfairly like this." Marcus, who had been silent throughout the meeting, finally spoke up. "Miss Lopez, I don't just want to prove my innocence. I want this to change. I want the system to be held accountable." Sarah smiled, sensing the determination in Marcus's voice. "I understand, Marcus, and I promise you we'll do everything we can to make that happen." The meeting ended with a clear plan of action. Sarah would begin by filing a lawsuit against Officer Jack Miller in the police department, as well as organizing a press conference to bring the case to public attention. She would also collaborate with civil rights organizations to rally community support. As the Johnson family left Sarah's office, they felt a renewed sense of hope. Though the road ahead would be long and challenging, they knew they were no longer alone. With Sarah Lopez's help and the support of the community, they believed justice could be achieved. Jack Miller, a veteran police officer with over 20 years of experience, was a well-known name in the community where he worked. To many, Jack was a symbol of order and discipline. He had received numerous commendations for outstanding performance in maintaining public safety and was often praised as someone who wasn't afraid to confront troublemakers. But behind the accolades and medals, Jack Miller was a complex individual, harboring deep-seated prejudices and a long history of abusing his authority. Jack grew up in a middle-class family in a small town where racial biases quietly lingered beneath the surface. His father, a former military man, often taught him that discipline is everything, and that some people would never follow the rules. These lessons, though never explicitly stated, became ingrained in Jack's mind from a young age. When he joined the police force as an adult, Jack carried those biases into his work, believing he was doing the right thing to protect the community. Throughout his career, Jack had been involved in numerous arrests, many of which were questioned for their legality. His actions often targeted Black individuals or members of minority communities, yet he always managed to escape accountability, protected by his colleagues and a police system riddled with flaws. To Jack, his actions weren't abuses of power. They were simply doing what was necessary to maintain order. That evening, after arresting Marcus Johnson, Jack returned home feeling completely at ease, as though he had just completed an important task. He didn't feel he had done anything wrong. In Jack's eyes, Marcus was just another troublemaker he had encountered hundreds of times before. A Black kid driving an old car late at night? There's definitely something suspicious, Jack thought to himself. To him, searching Marcus's car and finding the bag of white powder, which wasn't Marcus's, was just another part of his daily routine. Jack sat down on his couch, turned on the TV, and cracked open a beer. He flipped through the news channels, completely unaware that the video of Marcus's arrest had gone viral on social media and was sparking widespread outrage. When Jack's phone buzzed, he picked it up and heard the voice of a colleague, Officer Tom, who had worked with him for years. "Jack, have you seen the video yet?" Tom asked, his voice filled with concern. "What video?" Jack frowned, setting his beer down. "The arrest from tonight. Someone recorded it and posted it online. It's blowing up everywhere. You should take a look." Jack opened his phone and searched for the video Tom mentioned. As he watched the footage, he didn't feel regret or worry. Instead, he felt annoyed that someone had recorded him without permission. "Damn it, these people always want to make a big deal out of nothing," Jack muttered. "I was just doing my job." The next day, when Jack arrived at the police station, the atmosphere in the office felt different. Some of his colleagues looked at him with curiosity, while others avoided his gaze altogether. Jack walked into the break room where a group of officers was discussing the video. "Jack, are you okay?" Tom asked, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I'm fine," Jack replied, his tone calm. "I didn't do anything wrong. You know as well as I do that kid was up to no good. I just did what needed to be done." Some of his colleagues nodded in agreement. "That's right," another officer said. "These kids nowadays think they can do whatever they want without consequences. You were just doing your job, Jack." But not everyone supported Jack. A few younger officers who had recently joined the force began questioning his actions. "I don't know, Jack," a young officer named Mike said. "I watched the video, and I think we need to be more careful. The public is really angry about this." Jack turned to Mike, his expression cold. "You think I did something wrong? You think I should have just let that kid go without checking anything? You're still green, Mike. When you've been on the job long enough, you'll understand that sometimes we have to do unpleasant things to keep order." Mike fell silent, but the look in his eyes showed that he didn't fully agree with Jack. The tension in the room grew thick, and Jack decided to leave, not wanting to continue the conversation. When Jack returned to his desk, he received a call from his superior, asking him to come to the office to discuss the incident. In the office, Captain Harris, a middle-aged man with a stern demeanor, looked at Jack with an unreadable expression. "Jack, you know the video of last night's arrest is causing a lot of trouble, right?" Harris said, his tone serious. "Yes, I know," Jack replied, trying to remain composed. "But I didn't do anything wrong. I was just doing my job." "Maybe so," Harris said. "But the public doesn't see it that way. We're under pressure from the community and the media. I need you to be more careful moving forward. And if there's any investigation, I expect you to cooperate." Jack nodded, but inside he felt irritated. He didn't like being criticized, especially when he believed he had done nothing wrong. but he also understood that the situation was becoming more complicated. That evening, when Jack returned home, he turned on the TV and saw news reports about Marcus's arrest being broadcast on multiple channels. Journalists, human rights activists, and even ordinary citizens were speaking out against his actions. Jack could feel the pressure mounting on his shoulders. While some of his colleagues still supported him, he couldn't deny that public opinion was turning against him. Jack sat alone in his living room, staring at the TV screen. He told himself he hadn't done anything wrong, that he was just doing his job. But deep down, a sense of unease began to creep in. Was he really in the right? Or was he just a part of a system that had gone unchecked for far too long? Marcus Johnson sat across from attorney Sarah Lopez in her small but welcoming office. The room was quiet, with only the sound of Sarah's pen gliding across her notepad as she took notes. Marcus, a young man with a tired expression but determined eyes, began recounting his experience on the night of his arrest. It was the first time he had faced such blatant and cruel injustice, but it wasn't the first time he had felt treated unfairly because of the color of his skin. "Miss Lopez, I never thought I'd find myself in a situation like this," Marcus began, his voice low but steady. "I'm a good student. I've never had a criminal record, and I've always tried to stay out of trouble, but it seems like none of that matters. To them, I'm just a black man, and that's enough to make me a target." Sarah nodded, her eyes focused on him. "Tell me everything that happened, Marcus. I want to understand it all." Marcus took a deep breath, trying to stay calm as he recalled the events. "That night I was driving home after visiting a friend. My car isn't new, but it runs fine. When I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw a police car with its lights flashing, signaling me to pull over. I didn't know what was going on, but I complied. I stopped the car, turned off the engine, and waited for them to approach." He paused for a moment, his eyes dropping to the floor as if trying to push away the painful memory. "Officer Jack Miller came up to me and asked for my license and registration. I handed them over, but he barely looked at them. Instead, he started asking questions like, 'What are you doing here?' And 'Is this car even yours?' I answered politely, but he didn't believe me. Then he told me to step out of the car and began searching it without any reason." Sarah stopped writing and looked up. "Did they give you any reason for pulling you over?" "No," Marcus replied, his voice filled with frustration. "They didn't say anything. They just acted like I had done something wrong. When he found that bag of white powder in the car, I was shocked. It wasn't mine. I don't even know where it came from, but he didn't care. He handcuffed me and took me to the station like I was some kind of criminal." Sarah looked at Marcus, her expression filled with empathy. "You did well to stay calm in that situation, but I understand the helplessness you must have felt. This isn't just about you, Marcus. This is about a system that has gone unchallenged for far too long." Sitting next to Marcus was his mother, Linda Johnson, who had been quietly listening to her son's story. Her eyes were red, but they shone with determination. When Marcus finished speaking, she broke her silence, her voice trembling but full of emotion. "Miss Lopez, this isn't the first time my family has faced injustice," she said. "We've lived in this area for over 20 years, but we've never truly felt accepted. Just because we're black, people always look at us with suspicion. Marcus is a good kid. He's always worked hard in school and stayed out of trouble, but none of that matters. To them, he's just a black boy, and that's enough to make him a target." Linda paused, wiping away her tears with a tissue. "I've always taught my son that if he does the right thing, if he follows the law, he'll be safe. But now, I'm not so sure anymore. How can I tell him to trust a system that treats us like this?" Sarah leaned forward, her gaze steady and reassuring. "Mrs. Johnson, I understand your pain, and I promise you, we won't let this go. Your family deserves justice, and Marcus deserves to have his name cleared." The conversation continued for another hour, as Sarah gathered more details from Marcus and his family. She asked about Marcus's life, his academic achievements, and the challenges his family had faced living in a community filled with prejudice. Each answer only strengthened Sarah's resolve to bring this case to light. When the meeting finally ended, Sarah stood up, her expression firm and determined. "I've seen the video of the arrest, and I believe we have a strong case. I'm going to file a lawsuit against Officer Jack Miller and the police department for abuse of power and discrimination. But we're not stopping there. I'm going to organize a press conference to make this case public. We need the community's support, and I believe that once people know the truth, they'll stand with us." Marcus nodded, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Thank you, Miss Lopez. I don't want this to just be about proving my innocence. I want this to change. I want the system to be held accountable. Sarah smiled, sensing the determination in Marcus's voice. I understand, Marcus, and I promise you, we'll do everything we can to make that happen. The atmosphere at the police station had become more tense than ever. Jack Miller's case not only sparked outrage in the community, but also created a clear divide among his colleagues. In recent days, every conversation at the station revolved around the viral video and Jack's actions during the arrest of Marcus Johnson. Although no one confronted him directly, Jack knew he had become the center of heated debates. At the station, the officers had split into two distinct factions. One group, mostly made up of longtime colleagues, supported Jack. They believed he was simply doing his job and didn't deserve the criticism. To them, Jack was a veteran officer who had dedicated over 20 years to maintaining order. These supporters argued that what Jack did was necessary to deal with troublemakers and protect the community. Jack was just doing his job, said an officer named Paul in the break room. We all know that sometimes we have to make tough decisions. If he hadn't checked that car, who knows what could have happened? Maybe he stopped a dangerous criminal. Jack's supporters often gathered together, trying to defend him against the growing criticism from the public. They believed the media and public outrage were blowing the situation out of proportion, turning a minor incident into a major crisis. However, the other faction, which included many younger officers, began to question Jack's actions. They couldn't ignore what they had seen in the video. To them, Jack's behavior wasn't just an abuse of power, it was damaging the reputation of the entire police department. We can't just turn a blind eye, said a young officer named Mike during an internal meeting. That video clearly shows Jack crossing the line. If we don't take responsibility, how can we expect the community to trust us? Mike's words made the atmosphere in the meeting room tense. Some officers nodded in agreement, while others shook their heads in frustration. The divide within the station was becoming more apparent, and Jack could feel it every time he walked into a room. Jack began to feel isolated. Colleagues he had been close to for years were now keeping their distance. Some no longer joined him in conversations, while others only spoke to him when absolutely necessary. Jack couldn't help but notice the suspicious glances from some of his co-workers as he walked down the hallways. One morning, as Jack entered the break room, he saw a group of officers talking. The moment he stepped in, the conversation abruptly stopped. No one said a word, and the atmosphere became awkward. Jack felt like a stranger in the very place he had worked for over 2 decades. What's going on? Jack asked, trying to keep his voice calm. Nothing, one officer replied, but his expression said otherwise. Jack sighed, grabbed his coffee, and left the room. He knew people were talking about him, and it made him feel both angry and helpless. He had always believed he was just doing his job, but now, even those he considered friends were starting to turn their backs on him. That evening, when Jack returned home, he felt more exhausted than ever. He sat down on the couch, opened a beer, and turned on the TV, trying to forget the stress at work. But just as he was about to relax, his phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. We know who you are. You'll pay for what you've done. Jack read the message, his heart pounding. He stared at the screen, trying to make sense of it. Who had sent this? What did they mean? A chill ran down his spine. This wasn't the first time he had faced criticism from the community, but it was the first time he had received a direct threat. He stood up, walked to the window, and pulled back the curtain to look outside. The street in front of his house was quiet, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that someone might be watching him. He checked the locks on his doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. Jack sat back down, his mind racing. He had always thought of himself as strong, someone who couldn't be shaken by public opinion. But now, faced with isolation from his colleagues and threats from the outside, he was beginning to feel the weight of it all. Jack sat alone in his living room, staring at his phone screen. He didn't know who had sent the message, but it left him feeling deeply unsettled. For the first time in his career, Jack felt like he was losing control of the situation. Everything he had once believed in, his job, his colleagues, and even himself, seemed to be crumbling. In the darkness of the room, Jack began to wonder if he had truly done the right thing. But before he could find an answer, one thing became clear in his mind. This was only the beginning of the troubles he was about to face. Sarah Lopez sat in her office, her eyes fixed on the computer screen. In front of her was a collection of documents, reports, and files that her team had gathered over the past few days. The case of Marcus Johnson was not an isolated incident. The deeper Sarah dug, the more she realized that this was just the tip of a massive iceberg. Jack Miller, a man many had once regarded as a model officer, turned out to have a past riddled with abuse of power and injustice. "What do we have so far?" Sarah asked, turning to her assistant David, who was sitting beside her with a thick stack of files. "A lot," David replied, his tone serious. "Jack Miller has been involved in at least 12 similar incidents over the past 20 years. All of the victims were either black or from minority communities. And the most troubling part is that none of these cases were ever properly investigated. Every single one of them was covered up by the police system." Sarah frowned, feeling a surge of anger rise within her. How did they manage to cover all of this up? David flipped through a few pages in the file. Most of the incidents were never officially recorded. Victims who filed complaints were either threatened or ignored. Some were even arrested on baseless charges. And Jack was always protected by his colleagues and superiors. They saw him as a hero, someone who maintained order, no matter what he did. Sarah nodded, her expression cold and determined. "We need to find a victim who's willing to speak out, someone who can tell their story and help us expose the truth." David hesitated for a moment before responding. "There is someone, but their story didn't end well. Jamal Carter. He was arrested by Jack 5 years ago. Jack falsely accused him of drug possession, and Jamal ended up spending nearly a year in prison before being released. But after he got out, he couldn't find a job, and his life completely fell apart. In the end, he took his own life." Sarah was silent for a moment, feeling a sharp pang of sadness. "What about Jamal's family? Would they be willing to talk to us?" "I reached out to his mother, Angela Carter," David said. "She agreed to meet with us, but she's still deeply hurt by what happened." The next day, Sarah and David visited Angela Carter at her small home on the outskirts of the city. Angela, an older woman with tired but resolute eyes, welcomed them inside. On the walls were photos of Jamal from when he was alive, hung neatly as a constant reminder of the son she had lost. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us," Sarah said gently. "We know this is a difficult subject, but we want to learn more about what happened to Jamal. We believe his story can help us expose the truth." Angela sat down on the couch, her trembling hands clasped tightly together. "Jamal was a good boy," she began, her voice breaking. "He never did anything wrong, but Jack Miller destroyed his life. He falsely accused him of possessing drugs, and no one believed him when he said he was innocent. He spent nearly a year in prison for something he didn't do, and when he got out, he wasn't the same. He lost his job, his friends, and his faith in life." Angela paused, tears streaming down her face. "I tried to help him, but I couldn't. One day, I came home and found him. He had hanged himself in his bedroom. He left a note saying he couldn't live in a world where justice didn't exist." Sarah felt her throat tighten. "I'm so sorry, Angela. No one should have to endure what you and Jamal went through. We will do everything we can to bring the truth to light." Angela nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "If Jamal's story can help stop people like Jack Miller, I'm willing to tell it all. I don't want any other family to go through the pain I've been through." With Angela's testimony and the evidence Sarah's team had gathered, the picture of Jack Miller became increasingly clear. He wasn't just an officer who abused his power. He was a symbol of a corrupt police system that enabled and protected such behavior. Sarah knew this was an opportunity not only to hold Jack accountable, but also to challenge the system that had allowed him to operate unchecked. Sarah decided to hold a press conference to reveal her findings. During the conference, she presented detailed accounts of the cases Jack had been involved in, from unlawful arrests to false accusations and threats against victims. She also shared Jamal Carter's story, emphasizing that his death was a direct result of the injustice Jack and the police system had inflicted upon him. "This is not just about one police officer," Sarah said to the dozens of reporters and cameras in the room. "This is about a system that has allowed these abuses to continue for years. We cannot let people like Jack Miller continue to abuse their power without consequences. Justice is not just a concept, it must be a reality." The press conference quickly became the center of public attention. Media outlets covered the story extensively, and social media was flooded with posts, comments, and shares about the case. Outrage in the community grew even stronger, not just against Jack Miller, but also against the police system that had shielded him. At the police station, the atmosphere became even more tense. Colleagues who had once supported Jack now began to question him. Jack, who had once been confident that he could weather the storm, now felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He knew the truth had been exposed, and this time, there was no escaping the consequences. Meanwhile, Sarah and her team continued to prepare for the legal battle ahead. They knew this wasn't just a lawsuit. It was a fight for justice, not only for Marcus Johnson, but for all the victims who had been wronged by Jack Miller and the corrupt system that had protected him. That morning, the atmosphere outside the police station was more tense than ever. Hundreds of people had gathered early, carrying banners, megaphones, and an anger that could no longer be contained. Slogans like "Justice for Marcus Johnson," "End police abuse," and "Jack Miller must be held accountable" were held high, while chants demanding justice echoed through the streets. This was not just a protest for Marcus Johnson. It was the voice of a community that had endured injustice for far too long. Sarah Lopez stood at a distance, observing the crowd. She could feel the heat of their anger, but she also saw hope in their eyes. This was what she and her team had worked so hard to achieve, awakening the community and forcing them to confront the truth. But she also knew that when emotions ran high, things could spiral out of control. Inside the police station, Jack Miller sat in his office, feeling like a prisoner. He had been ordered to stay inside the building to avoid any confrontation with the crowd outside. To Jack, this was a humiliation. For over 20 years, he had taken pride in his role as a keeper of order. But now, he was being forced to sit idly by while hundreds of people outside chanted his name as a symbol of injustice. Jack looked out the window where he could see part of the crowd. The chants felt like daggers to his pride. "Jack Miller must be held accountable," the phrase repeated over and over like an unrelenting accusation. He clenched his fists, feeling both anger and helplessness. "This is how they treat me after everything I've done for this city," Jack muttered bitterly. He thought back to the times he had been praised, the awards he had received, and the respect he had commanded from his colleagues and superiors. But now, all of that seemed meaningless. A colleague walked in carrying a cup of coffee. "Jack, it's best if you stay here. Things are getting really heated outside. We don't want anything to happen." Jack didn't respond, only nodded. But inside, he felt like he was being sidelined, as if he were a criminal. He couldn't understand why people had turned on him so quickly. "I was just doing my job," he thought. "I was just doing what was necessary to maintain order." Outside, the protest grew louder and more intense. The crowd wasn't just made up of young people. There were families, older individuals, and even victims of past injustices. An elderly woman took the microphone, sharing the story of her son, who had been wrongfully arrested by Jack Miller. Her voice trembled, but it was filled with determination. "My son did nothing wrong," she said, tears streaming down her face. "But Jack Miller destroyed his life, and now I stand here to demand justice, not just for my son, but for everyone who has been treated unfairly." Her words ignited the crowd further. The chants grew louder, as if they could break through the walls of the police station. Sarah stood nearby, listening to the woman's story. She felt a pang of pain in her heart, but also a sense of purpose. This was why she had started this investigation, to give voices like this a platform to be heard. However, not everyone in the crowd remained calm. A small group of agitators began to break away from the main protest. They didn't carry banners or chant slogans. Instead, their eyes burned with anger and a desire to cause destruction. One of them picked up a rock and hurled it at a police car parked nearby. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the air, drawing the attention of those around them. Some people shouted, trying to stop them, but the agitators had already begun their rampage. They smashed police car windows, dented doors, and spray-painted phrases like "No justice, no peace." Inside the police station, Jack heard the commotion and the sound of breaking glass. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked down. The scene outside filled him with both rage and frustration. "These are the people I've been protecting all these years," he thought. "They're not grateful. They just want to destroy everything." Another officer entered the room, his face tense. "Jack, things are getting out of hand. We've called for backup to control the crowd, but you need to stay inside. This isn't the time to confront them." Jack turned around, his eyes blazing with anger. "I don't need anyone telling me what to do," he said. But deep down, he knew there was nothing he could do in this situation. He felt trapped, not just in the building, but in the consequences of actions he had once believed were justified. Sarah, standing amidst the crowd, also realized that the situation was spiraling out of control. She quickly moved toward the group of agitators, trying to reason with them. "Stop!" she shouted. "This isn't the way to demand justice. Violence will only make things worse." Some of the agitators paused, but others continued their destruction. Sarah felt a wave of helplessness, but knew she couldn't let the situation escalate further. She turned to one of the protest organizers and said, "We need to calm everyone down. If we don't, they'll use this against us." The organizer nodded and quickly grabbed a megaphone to address the crowd. "We are here to demand justice, not to destroy. Don't let a few people ruin our cause." Gradually, the crowd began to settle, but the tension lingered. The damaged police cars stood as symbols of the community's anger, but also served as a reminder that violence was not the path to justice. As night fell, the protests continued, but the atmosphere grew quieter and more subdued. Sarah left the scene, feeling exhausted, but more determined than ever. She knew this was just the beginning. The fight for justice would not be easy, but she believed that with the community's unity, the truth would prevail, and people like Jack Miller would be held accountable. Inside the police station, Jack sat alone in his office, listening to the muffled chants outside. He felt as though the entire world was against him. But deep down, he knew that the days of being shielded by the system were over. Now he would have to face the consequences of everything he had done. That night, Jack Miller sat alone in the dimly lit living room of his house. The faint glow of a desk lamp cast shadows on the bare walls, creating a cold and desolate atmosphere. On the table in front of him sat a half-empty bottle of whiskey, accompanied by a glass he kept filling and draining. The TV was off. There was no music playing, just silence, heavy and oppressive. But in his mind, the noise was deafening. The chants of the protesters, the sound of shattering glass, and the accusations he couldn't escape. Jack leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, but the image of Jamal Carter suddenly appeared in his mind. It was a memory he had tried to bury for years, but now it resurfaced, vivid and more painful than ever. 5 years ago, Jack had arrested Jamal Carter in a dark alley. Jamal, then a young man, had been on his way home after finishing a late shift at work. Jack could still remember the fear in Jamal's eyes when he was stopped. "I didn't do anything wrong," Jamal had said, his voice trembling. But Jack, with the confidence of someone who always believed he was right, didn't listen. Jack had found a small bag of white powder in Jamal's car. But the truth was, that bag didn't belong to Jamal. Jack knew it. He had planted it there himself, an act he had once justified as necessary to maintain order. A young black kid driving an old car in this neighborhood at night? There's definitely something wrong, Jack had thought at the time. He hadn't felt guilty about it. To him, Jamal was just another troublemaker in a long line of people he had dealt with during his career. But now, sitting alone in the dark, Jack couldn't stop thinking about what had happened afterward. Jamal had been convicted and spent nearly a year in prison. When he was released, his life had completely fallen apart. Unable to find a job and ostracized by society, Jamal had eventually taken his own life. Jack remembered hearing about Jamal's suicide at the time, and he had felt nothing more than a fleeting discomfort. "That's not my fault," he had told himself. But now those excuses no longer worked. The image of Jamal haunted Jack. Not as a troublemaker, but as a human being, a young man with a future that Jack had stolen. He remembered the look in Jamal's eyes when he was handcuffed, a look of fear and helplessness. "I didn't do anything wrong." Those words echoed in Jack's mind over and over like an unrelenting accusation. Jack stood up, walked to the kitchen counter, and poured himself another glass of whiskey. He downed it in one gulp, hoping the alcohol would dull the thoughts tormenting him. But it didn't work. The memories clung to him, like a shadow he couldn't escape. He began to question himself. Am I really the hero I thought I was? For over 20 years, Jack had believed he was a protector of the community, a keeper of order. He had received countless accolades, medals, and respect from his colleagues. But now, looking back, he couldn't help but wonder if any of it truly mattered. Jack thought about all the times he had abused his power, all the times he had arrested innocent people simply because they looked suspicious. He had always justified his actions as being for the greater good, as necessary to protect the community. But the truth was, he hadn't protected anyone. He had only protected his own ego and upheld a system that allowed him to act without consequence. Jack returned to his chair, holding the glass of whiskey in his hand but not drinking it. He stared at the amber liquid, as if searching for answers within it. But all he found was emptiness. He recalled Sarah Lopez's words during a recent press conference. "This isn't just about one police officer. This is about a system that has allowed abuses of power to go unchecked for years." Those words felt like a knife to Jack's pride. He had always thought of himself as part of the solution, but now he realized he was part of the problem. Jack looked around his living room, the bare walls, the medals hanging on the shelf, and the photos of him in his police uniform. These were once symbols of pride, but now they only filled him with disgust. He no longer recognized the man he had become. As the night wore on, Jack sank deeper into his thoughts. He stood up, walked into the bathroom, and looked at himself in the mirror. The reflection staring back at him was a man with bloodshot eyes, a gaunt face, and an expression of emptiness. Jack stared at himself, trying to find the person he once thought he was. But all he saw was a stranger, a man who had abused his power, destroyed innocent lives, and was now haunted by the weight of his own conscience. Jack raised a hand to touch the mirror, as if trying to reach the person on the other side. But he knew there was no way to go back. What he had done couldn't be undone, and the consequences of his actions would haunt him forever. He returned to the living room, poured himself another glass of whiskey, but this time, he didn't drink it. He just sat there, staring at the glass, letting his thoughts consume him. That night, Jack didn't sleep. He sat alone, facing the ghosts of his past, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure who he was anymore. Marcus Johnson sat in his small room, the light from his desk lamp illuminating sheets of paper filled with scribbled thoughts. Days had passed since the video of his arrest went viral on social media, and his life had completely changed. At first, he just wanted the ordeal to end. He didn't want to be the center of attention, didn't want to be dragged into debates or struggles. But now, seeing the community's outrage, the growing protests, and hearing the heartbreaking stories of others who had been victims like him, Marcus realized he couldn't stay silent. He recalled the moment Jack Miller stopped him on the road. The fear, helplessness, and humiliation were still fresh in his mind. But now, that fear had slowly turned into determination. Marcus knew he wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for those who didn't have the chance to speak up, for those who had been crushed by this unjust system. That afternoon, Marcus stepped out of his house and headed to the town square where a large protest was taking place. Hundreds of people had gathered, carrying banners and chanting slogans demanding justice. When Marcus appeared, the crowd immediately recognized him. Applause and words of encouragement erupted, but Marcus still felt a twinge of nervousness. He had never spoken in front of such a large crowd before, but as he looked into the eyes of those around him, he knew he couldn't back down. Sarah Lopez, who had been helping Marcus over the past few days, approached him. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice gentle but encouraging. Marcus took a deep breath and nodded. "I don't know if I'll do well, but I'll try," Sarah smiled. "You don't have to be perfect. Just speak the truth. Speak from your heart. People will listen." Marcus stepped onto the small makeshift stage facing the crowd. He took the microphone, his hands trembling slightly, but his gaze was steady. The noise gradually died down as everyone waited for him to speak. "Hello, everyone," Marcus began, his voice hoarse but clear. "I'm Marcus Johnson. Many of you have probably seen the video of my arrest. I'm not here to retell what happened, because you all already know. I'm here because I've realized that what happened to me wasn't an isolated incident. It's part of a much bigger problem, one that has existed for years and has hurt so many people." Marcus paused for a moment, looking at the crowd. He saw attentive eyes, faces filled with emotion. That gave him strength. "At first, I just wanted it all to go away. I just wanted to go back to my normal life. But then I realized that if I stayed silent, people like Jack Miller would continue doing what they've been doing. And people like me, like you, would continue to be victims. I can't let that happen." Applause broke out, but Marcus raised his hand to signal for quiet. He continued, his voice growing stronger. "We can't change the past, but we can change the future. We need a police system that is fairer, more transparent, and more accountable. We need to make sure that no one, whether they're a police officer or anyone else, can abuse their power without facing consequences. And to do that, we need to stand together. We need to speak up, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who can't." The crowd erupted into cheers and chants. Marcus felt a surge of energy coursing through him. He no longer felt afraid or nervous. He felt like he was doing the right thing. "Thank you for being here today," Marcus said, his voice softening. "But this is just the beginning. We need to keep fighting, not just on the streets, but in meeting rooms, in courtrooms, and in the hearts of everyone. We need change, and I believe we can make it happen." As Marcus finished his speech, the crowd rose to their feet, clapping and cheering. Many people came up to shake his hand and hug him, thanking him for his courage to speak out. Marcus felt a warmth he had never experienced before. He no longer felt alone. He knew he had found a community, a purpose greater than himself. However, not everyone supported Marcus. That evening, when he returned home, his phone was flooded with messages and calls from unknown numbers. Some were words of encouragement, but others were threats. "You better watch your back," one message read. "You don't know who you're messing with." Marcus read the messages, feeling a twinge of unease, but he refused to let them deter him. He knew that standing up for justice wouldn't be easy. He knew there would be people who wanted to protect the old system, people who would do anything to stop him. But Marcus also knew he couldn't turn back. He had started this journey, and he wasn't going to stop. Before going to bed, Marcus looked out the window, where the streetlights illuminated the quiet street. He thought about the people who had supported him, who had stood by him in this fight. And he thought about people like Jamal Carter, those who no longer had the chance to speak up. Marcus vowed that he wouldn't let their sacrifices be in vain. That night, Marcus didn't feel fear. He felt stronger than ever. He knew the road ahead would be full of challenges, but he also knew he was no longer alone. The community had risen, and he would continue to fight, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been crushed by injustice. Sarah Lopez sat in her office, the light from her computer screen illuminating her tense face. In front of her were stacks of documents, reports, and files that she and her team had gathered over the past few weeks. The deeper she dug into Jack Miller's case, the more she realized that this wasn't just about one rogue police officer abusing his power. It was about a system that had enabled, concealed, and protected such behavior for years. "David, do you see this?" Sarah called out, her voice urgent. David, her assistant, walked in holding a thick stack of files. "What's going on?" he asked, placing the files on her desk. Sarah pointed at her computer screen. "I just found an internal report from 2015. It documents a complaint about Jack Miller's misconduct. But here's the strange part. The report was never escalated to higher authorities. It was marked as insufficient evidence and filed away." David frowned, flipping through the documents in his hands. "This isn't the first time. I just found at least 3 similar cases. Victims filed complaints, but all of them were dismissed or disappeared from the system. And the common thread, they all involved Jack." Sarah sat back in her chair, her expression a mix of anger and frustration. "They've been deliberately covering this up," she said, her voice low. "Not just Jack, but the entire system. They've been protecting him, allowing him to continue abusing his power without facing any consequences." David nodded, his face also filled with anger. "We need someone inside the police department, someone willing to testify. Without that, all we have are lifeless documents. We need a voice from within." A few days later, Sarah received an unexpected phone call. On the other end of the line was a familiar but hesitant voice. "Sarah, it's me, David. Officer David," the man said, his voice low and tense. Sarah sat up straight. "David, you want to talk to me?" "Yes," he replied. "I can't stay silent anymore. I worked with Jack Miller for years and I know a lot about what he's done. But it's not just him. The entire police department has issues. I want to tell the truth." Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. "David, if you're willing to testify, it could make a huge difference. But are you sure? This could be very dangerous." There was a pause on the other end before David replied. "I know, but I can't live with this guilt anymore. I've seen too much and I've stayed silent for too long." 2 days later, Sarah met David at a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. David, a middle-aged man with a tired face and worried eyes, sat across from her. He kept glancing around, as if afraid someone was watching. "Thank you for coming," Sarah said, trying to ease his tension. "I know this isn't easy." David nodded, his hands gripping his coffee cup tightly. "I've thought about this a lot before calling you. But I can't stay silent anymore. Jack Miller, he's not the only one. The entire system has been protecting him. Those reports about his misconduct? They didn't just disappear by accident. They were erased, altered, or buried by people inside the department." Sarah leaned forward, listening intently. "Can you tell me more? Who's behind this cover-up?" David sighed, his eyes filled with exhaustion. "It's our superiors. They always said Jack was a hero, that he did things no one else dared to do. But the truth is, they were afraid that if Jack's actions were exposed, it would damage the reputation of the entire department. So they covered everything up. They threatened victims, dismissed complaints, and even altered records to protect him." Sarah felt a surge of anger rising within her. So they weren't just tolerating Jack, they were actively protecting him no matter what he did. David nodded. Exactly. And I'm guilty too. I stayed silent, I turned a blind eye. But now I can't do it anymore. Sarah and David began working together, gathering evidence and preparing his testimony. But it didn't take long for trouble to arise. One evening, as David was driving home, he received a call from an unknown number. On the other end was a cold, menacing voice. You'd better be careful. You don't know who you're messing with. A chill ran down David's spine. He knew that people inside the police department had discovered his intentions. In the days that followed, he received more threatening messages and warnings, all urging him to stay silent if he wanted to stay safe. One evening, David met with Sarah again, his face pale and filled with worry. I don't know if I can keep doing this, he said, his voice trembling. They know what I'm doing. They've been threatening me. I'm scared they'll hurt me or my family. Sarah looked at David, sensing the fear in him. David, I understand how hard this is, but if you back out, they'll keep doing what they've been doing. You're the only one who can help us expose the truth. David sat in silence, his eyes flickering between fear and determination. I need time to think, he said before leaving. As David left Sarah's office, she sat alone, feeling both anxious and helpless. She knew David was under immense pressure and she couldn't blame him if he decided to back out. But she also knew that without his testimony, their fight would become much harder. That night, Sarah sat in her office, staring at the documents in front of her. She knew the truth was within reach, but she also knew that the path to exposing it would be fraught with danger and obstacles. Marcus Johnson walked into the small corner grocery store, a place he often visited to pick up a few essentials. It was a quiet afternoon with soft sunlight streaming through the glass windows, creating a warm and peaceful atmosphere. Marcus only intended to grab some snacks and a drink before heading home. He had no idea that in just a few moments, he would come face to face with the one person he never wanted to see again. Jack Miller, no longer in his police uniform, was standing at the checkout counter. He held a can of beer and a pack of cigarettes, his face looking tired and tense. As Marcus entered, Jack's eyes immediately locked onto him. For a moment, both men froze, saying nothing. The air between them grew heavy, and the tension was palpable. Marcus felt a surge of anger rise within him, but he forced himself to stay calm. He didn't want to cause a scene. Jack, on the other hand, looked uneasy. He hadn't expected to run into Marcus here, and for a brief moment he considered turning away and pretending not to notice. But then, as if something compelled him, Jack stepped toward Marcus. Marcus, Jack said, his voice low and hesitant. I didn't expect to see you here. Marcus crossed his arms over his chest, his gaze cold and unwavering. I didn't expect to see you either, but it seems fate wants us to have a conversation. Jack nodded, trying to maintain his composure. Listen, I know you're angry. I know what happened. Wasn't right. But I was just doing my job. I didn't mean to hurt you. Marcus let out a bitter laugh, but it wasn't one of amusement. Your job? What exactly is your job? Stopping an innocent person just because of the color of their skin? Planting drugs on me to justify your actions? Is that your job? Jack looked flustered, unsure of how to respond. I didn't know things would go that far. I was just doing what I thought was right to protect the community. Marcus took a step closer to Jack, his eyes blazing with anger. Protect the community? You think abusing your power, arresting innocent people, and destroying their lives is protecting the community? You're not protecting anyone, Jack. You're just protecting yourself and the corrupt system you serve. Jack stood silent, unable to argue. He felt cornered, but at the same time, Marcus's words struck a chord deep within him. I'm not a bad person, Jack said, his voice faltering. I've been doing this job for over 20 years. I've arrested real criminals, dangerous people. I've saved lives. I'm not the monster you think I am. Marcus shook his head, his voice filled with disappointment. You may have done good things, but that doesn't erase the wrongs you've committed. You've hurt too many people, Jack. And the worst part is, you've never taken responsibility for your actions. You always justify them, always blame others or the circumstances. But the truth is, you made those choices. They were your decisions. Jack felt a sharp pang in his chest. Marcus's words were like a mirror, forcing him to confront himself. He had always thought of himself as a hero, someone who maintained order and protected the community. But now, he couldn't deny that there were times when he had crossed the line, when he had abused his power. You don't understand, Jack said, his voice trembling. This job, It's not easy. We face dangerous situations. We have to make split-second decisions. Sometimes we make mistakes. But I never meant to hurt you, Marcus. I swear. Marcus stared directly into Jack's eyes, his voice cold but resolute. Maybe you didn't mean to, but that doesn't matter. What you did had consequences, and you need to take responsibility for them. Justice isn't something you can bend to your will, Jack. Justice is about truth, accountability, and making things right. Jack said nothing, standing there as if every excuse he had ever made was crumbling before him. He had always believed he could avoid the truth, that he could continue living as he always had. But now, standing in front of Marcus, he realized that was no longer possible. "What do you want me to do?" Jack asked, his voice small and filled with helplessness. "I can't change what happened." Marcus's gaze softened slightly, though his tone remained firm. "No one's asking you to change the past, but you can change the future. You can start by admitting what you've done wrong, by taking responsibility, and helping to fix the system you've been a part of." Jack lowered his head, feeling the weight of guilt pressing down on him. He didn't know if he had the courage to do what Marcus was asking, but he also knew that if he continued to run from the truth, he would never find peace. As Marcus left the store, Jack remained standing there, silently watching him go. The brief but intense conversation between them had left a deep impression on him. For the first time in years, Jack began to question whether everything he had done was truly as justified as he had always believed. He was no longer certain about his role, about the decisions he had made. Jack knew he couldn't keep running from the truth. Marcus's words echoed in his mind, forcing him to confront himself. And though the road ahead seemed daunting, Jack understood that it was time for him to change. In recent days, the police department had become the center of public attention. Protests erupted across the city, with hundreds of people holding signs demanding justice for Marcus Johnson and other victims of abuse of power. On social media, the video of Marcus's arrest continued to spread rapidly, fueling a wave of outrage from the community. Major news outlets began covering the story, raising questions about transparency and accountability within the police force. Meanwhile, city officials could no longer ignore the growing pressure. The mayor, who had previously expressed public support for the police, was forced to hold a press conference to address the situation. "We are committed to thoroughly investigating this matter," he declared in front of a sea of cameras. "No one is above the law, and we will ensure that justice is served." Shortly after, an internal investigation was launched. Senior officers within the police department, who had once protected Jack Miller, now distanced themselves to safeguard their own reputations. They no longer openly supported Jack, but instead began shifting the blame onto him to deflect public scrutiny. Jack, once hailed as the department's hero, had now become the focal point of criticism. Jack Miller sat alone in his small house, the dim light from a desk lamp casting shadows across his weary face. On the table in front of him lay a letter from the police department, informing him that he had been suspended from duty pending the results of the investigation. Jack stared at the letter, feeling as though everything around him was crumbling. He had spent over 20 years of his life serving in the police force, believing he was doing the right thing. He had faced dangerous situations, arrested criminals, and received numerous commendations from his superiors. But now, all of that seemed meaningless. The system he had trusted and defended was now turning its back on him. Jack felt betrayed. He couldn't understand why his colleagues, the people who had stood by his side, were now silent or even blaming him. "They knew what I was doing," Jack muttered bitterly. "They supported me, they covered for me, and now they're letting me take the fall." But deep down, Jack knew it wasn't that simple. Marcus's words still echoed in his mind, forcing him to confront the truth he had been avoiding. He couldn't deny that he had abused his power, that he had caused pain to innocent people, and now he was paying the price for his actions. While Jack wrestled with feelings of betrayal and guilt, an unexpected letter arrived at his home. The letter was in a plain envelope, with no distinguishing marks. Jack opened it, and as he read the first few lines, he felt his heart tighten. The letter was from the family of Jamal Carter. Jamal Carter was one of Jack's victims, a young man Jack had arrested on false charges of drug possession. Although Jamal was innocent, he had spent nearly a year in prison before being released. But his life never returned to normal. Unable to find a job, shunned by society, and burdened by an unshakable pain, Jamal had ended his own life just months after his release. The letter was written by Jamal's mother, Angela Carter. Her words were not filled with anger or hatred, but instead carried a deep sense of pain and disappointment. Jack Miller, I don't know if you will read this letter, but I still feel the need to write it. I am the mother of Jamal Carter, the young man you arrested 5 years ago. I am not writing this letter to curse you or demand revenge. I am writing because I want you to understand the pain you have caused. Jamal was a good son. He was not a criminal, not a threat to anyone, but you turned him into one in the eyes of the world. You took away his dignity, his future, and ultimately, his life. I have lost my son, and that pain will never go away. But I don't want you to just feel guilty. I want you to change. I want you to understand that the power you hold is not meant to destroy but to protect. And if you truly regret what you've done, do something to make it right. Angela Carter. Jack read the letter over and over again, each word cutting into him like a knife. He couldn't stop the tears from streaming down his face. This wasn't the anger he had braced himself to face. This was pain, loss, and devastation that he had caused, and now it was weighing heavily on him. He sat there holding the letter, feeling as though everything around him was collapsing. Images of Jamal, of Marcus, and of the other victims he had arrested flashed through his mind. Jack could no longer avoid the truth. He could no longer blame the system, the circumstances, or anyone else. He had to face the consequences of his own actions. That night, Jack sat alone in the darkness, reflecting on what he had done and what he needed to do next. Angela Carter's letter had broken him, but it had also sparked a small glimmer of light within him. It was a chance for him to change, to begin making amends for his mistakes, even if only in a small way. Jack knew the road ahead would not be easy. He would have to face the judgment of the community, of the people he had hurt, and of himself. But for the first time in years, Jack felt that he could no longer live the way he had before. He had to do something to atone for his wrongs, to rediscover the true meaning of justice and responsibility. Jack Miller sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel tightly, his eyes fixed on the small house in front of him. It was a modest home in a quiet suburban neighborhood, with a small garden in the front yard. This was the home of Jamal Carter's family. Jack had spent the entire morning debating whether or not he should come here. He knew no apology could undo the damage he had caused, but he also knew he couldn't keep running away. Angela Carter's letter had broken him, but it had also forced him to confront the truth. Jack took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He stepped out of the car, each step toward the house feeling heavier than the last. When he reached the door, he hesitated for a moment before knocking. The sound of his knock echoed in the quiet air, and within seconds the door opened. Angela Carter stood before him, a middle-aged woman with tired but resolute eyes. She looked at Jack, not surprised, but not welcoming either. Perhaps she had already anticipated his visit. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice calm but cold. "I didn't think I'd see you here." Jack lowered his head, finding it difficult to meet her gaze. "Mrs. Carter, I came here to apologize. I know what I did to Jamal was wrong. I have no excuses. I just want to say that I'm deeply sorry." Angela was silent for a moment, her eyes never leaving Jack. Then she opened the door wider and gestured for him to come inside. "If you've come all this way, then come in, but I can't promise you forgiveness." Jack stepped inside, feeling the air in the house grow heavier with each step. The living room was small and cozy, with family photos hanging on the walls. One of the photos was of Jamal, his bright smile in the picture making Jack feel as though a weight was pressing down on his chest. Angela sat down on a chair across from Jack. "So, what do you want to say?" she asked, her voice devoid of emotion. Jack sat down, his hands clasped together, struggling to find the right words. "I know that my apology can't bring Jamal back. I know that I destroyed his life, and I caused your family pain that can never be undone. I'm not here to ask for forgiveness. I just want to acknowledge that I was wrong, and I deeply regret what I did." Angela looked at Jack, her eyes filled with both pain and strength. "You know, Mr. Miller, I've waited a long time to hear those words, but your apology doesn't change anything. Jamal is gone, my son is dead, and nothing can bring him back." Jack lowered his head, her words cutting through him like a knife. "I know," he said, his voice trembling. "I can't change the past, but I want to do something to make amends, even if it's just a small part." Angela sighed, her gaze softening slightly. "At the very least, you've admitted your mistakes. That's something I never thought I'd hear from you. But your regret isn't what I need. What I need is justice. And justice isn't just about words. It's about action. It's about change. Jack nodded, feeling her words sink deep into his mind. I understand. I'm considering resigning from the force and publicly taking responsibility for what I've done. I don't want to hide anymore. Angela looked at Jack, a hint of surprise in her eyes. If you truly do that, then maybe you'll start to make amends. But remember, this isn't for me, it's for the others, for the people you've hurt, and for the people you might be able to help in the future. Jack sat in silence, feeling Angela's words etch themselves into his mind. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he also knew he couldn't keep living the way he had been. As Jack left the Carter family's home, he felt as though a part of the burden in his heart had been lifted. But at the same time, another part had grown heavier. He had admitted his mistakes, but that was only the first step. He knew his apology wasn't enough, that he needed to take action to truly make amends. Driving home, Jack couldn't stop thinking about what Angela had said. Justice isn't just about words, it's about action. It's about change. Her words echoed in his mind, forcing him to confront the biggest question: what would he do next? When he arrived home, Jack sat down at his desk staring at his police badge. It had once been a symbol of pride and responsibility, but now it only filled him with guilt. He knew that resigning wasn't just about taking responsibility. It was also about starting over, about seeking redemption. Jack picked up the badge, the cold metal in his hand, feeling like a reminder of everything he had done. He knew this decision wouldn't be easy, that it would change his life completely. But he also knew that if he didn't do this, he would never find peace. That night, Jack sat in the darkness, thinking about what he needed to do. And for the first time in years, he felt as though he was heading in the right direction, even though the path ahead was still full of challenges. Jack Miller sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His eyes were fixed on the modest house in front of him, nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood with a small, well-kept garden. This was the home of Jamal Carter's family. Jack had spent the entire morning wrestling with himself, unsure if he had the courage to come here. He knew no apology could ever undo the harm he had caused, but he also knew he couldn't keep running from it. Angela Carter's letter had shaken him to his core, forcing him to confront the truth he had avoided for so long. Taking a deep breath, Jack tried to steady his nerves. He opened the car door and stepped out, each step toward the house feeling heavier than the last. When he reached the door, he hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorframe before he finally knocked. The sound echoed in the stillness of the afternoon, and within moments, the door creaked open. Angela Carter stood before him, her face lined with exhaustion, but her eyes sharp and resolute. She didn't look surprised to see him, but there was no warmth in her expression either. Perhaps she had been expecting this visit. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice calm but edged with coldness. "I didn't think you'd actually come." Jack lowered his gaze, unable to meet her eyes. "Mrs. Carter, I came here to apologize. I know what I did to Jamal was wrong. I have no excuses. I just want to say that I'm deeply, truly sorry." Angela didn't respond immediately. Her eyes stayed locked on Jack, studying him, as if trying to gauge the sincerity of his words. After a long pause, she stepped back and opened the door wider. "If you've come all this way, you might as well come in. But don't expect forgiveness." Jack nodded silently and stepped inside. The air in the house felt heavy, almost suffocating. The living room was small but cozy, with family photos adorning the walls. One photo in particular caught Jack's eye, a picture of Jamal, his smile bright and full of life. The sight of it made Jack's chest tighten, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him even harder. Angela sat down in a chair across from him, her posture straight and unyielding. "So," she said, her voice devoid of emotion, "what do you want to say?" Jack sat down as well, his hands clasped tightly together. He struggled to find the right words, his voice faltering as he began. "I know that no apology can bring Jamal back. I know that I destroyed his life, and I caused your family pain that can never be undone. I'm not here to ask for forgiveness. I just want to acknowledge that I was wrong, and I deeply regret what I did." Angela's gaze didn't waver. Her eyes were filled with a mix of pain and strength, emotions that seemed to cut through Jack like a blade. "You know, Mr. Miller," she said slowly, "I've waited a long time to hear those words, but your apology doesn't change anything. Jamal is gone. My son is dead, and nothing you say or do will ever bring him back." Jack lowered his head, her words hitting him like a punch to the gut. "I know," he said quietly, his voice trembling. I can't change the past, but I want to do something, anything to make amends, even if it's just a small part. Angela sighed, her expression softening just slightly. At the very least, you've admitted your mistakes. That's more than I ever thought I'd hear from you. But regret isn't enough. What I need isn't your guilt. What I need is justice. And justice isn't just about words. It's about action. It's about change. Jack nodded, her words sinking deep into his mind. I understand, he said. I'm considering resigning from the force and publicly taking responsibility for what I've done. I don't want to hide anymore. Angela's eyes flickered with a hint of surprise, but her tone remained steady. If you truly do that, then maybe you'll start to make amends. But remember, this isn't for me. It's for the others, for the people you've hurt, and for the people you might still be able to help. Jack sat in silence, letting her words settle over him. He knew she was right. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but he couldn't keep living the way he had been. He had to change. As Jack left the Carter family's home, he felt a strange mix of emotions. A part of the burden he had carried for so long seemed to have lifted, but another part had grown even heavier. He had taken the first step by admitting his mistakes, but he knew it wasn't enough. Words alone wouldn't heal the wounds he had caused. He needed to act. Driving home, Angela's words echoed in his mind. Justice isn't just about words. It's about action. It's about change. The truth of those words gnawed at him, forcing him to confront the question he had been avoiding. What would he do next? When he arrived home, Jack sat down at his desk, staring at his police badge. Once it had been a symbol of pride and responsibility, a reminder of the ideals he had sworn to uphold. But now, it felt like a weight of guilt, a reminder of the harm he had caused. He picked it up, the cold metal pressing against his palm, and stared at it for a long time. Resigning wasn't just about taking responsibility. It was about starting over. It was about seeking redemption, even if he wasn't sure he deserved it. Jack knew this decision would change his life completely, that it wouldn't be easy. But he also knew that if he didn't do this, he would never find peace. That night, Jack sat alone in the darkness, his thoughts racing. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, he felt as though he was heading in the right direction. The path ahead would be full of challenges, but Jack was ready to face them. He had to be. Jack Miller stood in his small office at the police station, his eyes fixed on the police badge that had been with him for over 20 years. The badge had once been a symbol of pride, responsibility, and the ideals he had pursued as a young man. But now, it was nothing more than a heavy weight, a reminder of the mistakes and pain he had caused. On the desk, his resignation letter lay completed, each line etched deeply into his mind. Jack knew this was something he had to do. There was no other way. He couldn't continue wearing the uniform, couldn't continue living as if he had done no wrong. He had hurt too many people, and now he had to take responsibility. Jack picked up the letter and walked out of his office. The colleagues who had once seen him as a hero now looked at him with cold or avoiding eyes. No one said a word as he walked down the hallway, but the silence spoke volumes. Jack felt like a stranger in the very place he had once called home. When he placed the resignation letter on his superior's desk, a mix of relief and pain washed over him. This was the end of a chapter in his life, but it was also the beginning of a new journey, one he had no idea where it would lead. Jack left the town the next morning, carrying only a few belongings and the heavy burden of his past mistakes. He drove through the familiar streets, places that had witnessed the years he had spent working, the times he thought he was protecting the community. But now, every corner, every road reminded him of the pain he had caused. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed to leave. This town was no longer his home. He needed time to think, to find a way to atone for his mistakes, if that was even possible. But deep down, Jack knew he might never truly make up for what he had done. Meanwhile, Marcus Johnson continued his fight. After his story spread, Marcus became a symbol of change in the community. He wasn't just fighting for his own justice, but also for others, those who had been abused, ignored, and hurt by the system Jack had once been a part of. Marcus began organizing community meetings where people could share their stories and work together to find solutions. He collaborated with nonprofit organizations, activists, and even some government officials to push for reform. Gradually, Marcus became a powerful voice, someone the community could trust. But Marcus didn't stop there. He understood that change couldn't come from just words or protests. He started participating in educational programs, helping young people in the community stay away from crime and build better futures. Marcus knew that justice wasn't just about punishing the wrongdoers, it was about creating opportunities for others. One afternoon, a few months after Jack had left town, a peaceful march was held in the city center. Hundreds of people joined, holding signs calling for justice and change. Leading the march was Marcus, his eyes filled with determination and his smile radiating hope. He walked among the crowd, feeling the strength of unity and the belief in a better future. Jack, by this time, had quietly returned to the town. He didn't join the march, not wanting to draw attention to himself. Instead, he stood at a distance, silently watching. He saw Marcus, the young man he had once dismissed as a troublemaker, now standing as a symbol of hope and change. Jack felt a strange mix of emotions, regret and admiration. He knew Marcus had achieved something he never could, turning pain into strength, transforming injustice into a driving force for change. Jack stood there, quietly observing the march as it passed by. He wondered if there was anything he could do to make amends for his mistakes. Could he ever find forgiveness, not just from others, but from himself? He didn't know the answer, but he knew he had to try. The story ends with the image of Marcus leading the march, sunlight shining down on him as a symbol of hope. From afar, Jack stood in the shadows, silently watching. He didn't know if he could ever truly atone for his mistakes, but he knew he had to start somewhere. And no matter how difficult the road ahead might be, Jack understood that justice wasn't a destination. It was a journey, a line he had to cross to find himself again.